Well, good morning to everyone. So we're addressing these next panels all through the day in English. So we're getting started. We have already Dr. Luís Carrilho and Professor Joseph online. They are not here, but we have here Professor Jay and Professor Svetoslav. And I'm passing the microphone to Professor Fernando Torrão, the moderator of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marisa Araújo, esteemed speakers of this panel.
So, just sorry to interrupt, I forgot. So sorry, Ugi, you're also there, right? Sorry, my fault, not to address you specifically. I see you now. Thank you, sorry, Ugi.
Professors, students, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, my compliments to all who follows us online in Lisbon and here in Oporto. I would like to congratulate Professors Margarida Salema de Oliveira Martins and Marisa Almeida Araújo for organizing this international congress, and thank the speakers of this panel for their presence. It's a great pleasure to welcome you in Lusiada University Law School in Oporto. This Congress deals with a fundamental subject in the fight against corruption, shaping an anti-corruption environment. In this panel, the subject is transnational aspects. The presentations will last between 15 and 20 minutes. The questions and subsequent debate will be in the final. The first presentation is made by Dr. Luís Carrilho. Dr. Luís Carrilho, the word is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear moderator, Professor Jay, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, dear fellow speakers, Professor Marisa, and of course, my dear and esteemed colleague, Marco, of the United Nations, but also of other tasks in the past. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be in this very high-level international congress. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to join you on behalf of almost 10,000 United Nations police officers coming from more than 90 countries, authorized to serve on the front lines in 16 peace operations around the world. For the ones that are less familiar, the United Nations Police are central to multilateral efforts to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict at the operational, structural, and systemic levels, and we are a key enabler of Sustainable Development Agenda, the Common Agenda, and the Secretary General Action for Peacekeeping Initiative. As our Secretary General and member states have reaffirmed time and again, it is often the breakdown of law and order that triggers United Nations deployments and, conversely, the establishment or re-establishment of policing and other rule of law functions that allows United Nations peace operations to downsize and eventually withdraw. By helping host state authorities maintain law and order, protect civilians, and engage with local populations through community-oriented policing, the United Nations Police have helped pave the way for some of the largest United Nations peacekeeping missions to transition and turn over primary security responsibilities to host state counterparts, like it was the case of Timor-Leste. We support security systems. The United Nations Police also support justice systems, including prosecution units and court. Although we are not usually directly involved in fighting corruption, we deploy to conflict often fertile ground for transnational organized criminals that both foster and thrive on corruption, threatening the rule of law, democratic governance, and regional and global security. Through our work to prevent and counter corruption, the United Nations provide a range of tailored technical assistance, including drafting anti-corruption policies, laws, and codes of conduct, strengthening asset declaration and whistleblower protection systems, and advising on investigations and prosecuting corruption, including through international cooperation. Even in UNMIC, the United Nations Police is the Interpol national point of contact. One means of delivering this support to member states and in the peace operations is our standing police capacity and other rule of law capacities that we have based in Brindisi, Italy, which comprise diverse specialized expertise in police capacity development and building, community-oriented policing, investigation and prosecution, prison management, security, and anti-corruption expertise. In addition, the Strategic Guidance Framework for International Policing, known by the acronym in the United Nations, we have several acronyms of SGF. As I said, our SGF, that is the so-called police doctrine, developed by the United Nations Police and member states, stipulates how we assist the policing services in building a culture of accountability through the systemic inclusion of United Nations core values into training. Through our mentoring and collocation, we can model appropriate behavior for host state authorities and their interactions with the local communities. Let me give you a few examples. For example, United Nations Police in MINUSCA, in Central African Republic, work with the internal security forces, police and gendarmerie, to implement strategies to educate new recruits about corruption and bribery. Since 2019, UNPOL has conducted at least 3 such trainings each year, and another 3 are planning for more than 150 personnel only this year. Anti-corruption issues are also routinely discussed during collocation activities with the national police and gendarmerie, and also in all the activities done together. In South Sudan, UNMIS, United Nations Police, have contributed to the development of an ethics and anti-corruption brochure for the South Sudanese National Police Service, which is being translated into Arabic as well, while the transition support plan of the advisory police unit in our mission in Darfur, Sudan, that is based in Khartoum, UNITAMS, includes support to the Sudan Police Force on strengthening accountability mechanisms for reporting and investigating complaints of police misconduct. Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary General Action for Peacekeeping Initiative, or A4P and A4P Plus, calls on all stakeholders to collectively address the challenges facing peacekeeping, including increasing accountability to our peacekeepers, ensuring their safety and security, and fighting impunity for those who carry attacks against them. With the recent establishment of the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Policing, co-chaired by the United Nations Department of Peace Operations, Police Division, and the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crimes, UNODC, which Marco Teixeira is, of course, the head of the program in Mozambique, we expect to see greater coordination on policing and law enforcement matters across the United Nations system, bringing together the expertise and resources of all United Nations partners will strengthen our collective efforts to address corruption, including its root causes and links to other aspects of peace, security, and development. This way, creating a stable environment for all to live in peace and security. In addition, we will bring together senior officials from our member states for the third United Nations Chiefs of Police Summit, called UN COPS, our acronym of UN COPS, this September, to explore today's most global security challenges and the most effective global policing responses. No doubt, corruption and the nexus with organized crime will figure prominently in the discussions. As we all know, when it comes to corruption and other transnational threats, national borders should be the last line of defense, not the first. That means working together in partnership to further enhance our relevance, credibility, and impact in the eyes of the people we are sworn to protect and serve. Once again, congratulations on this event, and thank you very much for the invitation, particularly to Professor Marisa and Marco from UNODC for this invitation and the very interesting Congress. I'm looking forward for the questions and answers that will follow after all the speakers that I'm also looking forward to listen. Once again, thank you very much, muito obrigado, and particularly today, the 5th of May, happy Portuguese World Language Day. Thank you very much.
Now is the turn for Ambassador Ugi Zvekic, Ambassador Head Permanent Observer Office of the European Public Law Organization to the United Nations in Vienna, Ambassador former Permanent Representative of the Republic of Serbia to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, visiting professor in University of Milan and in the University of Belgrade, Serbia, born in Belgrade, Serbia, former Yugoslavia. Ambassador Zvekic, also law degree, MA and PhD in sociology law. Ambassador Ugi Zvekic, it's your turn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jay, Moderator. It is indeed my great honor and pleasure to participate in this important event. I would like to express, of course, my gratitude to His Excellency Rector de la Universidad Lusiada in Oporto, And of course, to my colleague, a good friend of mine, Professor Marisa Almeida Araújo. I will somehow continue where Luís has started talking about transnational crime, and of course, from a little bit different perspective. So my topic is actually, how do we make more effective efforts to fight transnational crime? And I think today, when we talk about transnational organized crime, we cannot really talk without talking about corruption, because organized crime groups are more often than not using corruption in order to particularly place the profits of their illicit activities in the legal economy. And we can today also not talk anymore about corruption without really talking about organized corruption, that is groups that are involved in carrying out corruption. So we really have changes in the traditional organized crime paradigm and in the traditional corruption paradigm, and the two phenomena have been more and more linked, both at the national and regional level, but in particular at the international level. This is represented, of course, by this figure. They are all in some triangles, so there are really many connections, but I don't want to spend your time on that. What I want to focus on is that, as you know, within the United Nations framework, there are two what are called mega conventions, mega criminal justice conventions. One is the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, and another one, United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Both of them are already became mature. They are more than 20 years old, so there is a lot of experience with them. And if we go back to my introductory observations, what we have today is that organized corruption is actually transnational, and the grand corruption, particularly when we talk about a variety of organized crime activities, is of transnational nature. So the transnational organized corruption is not just a mere linguistic play of words, that is a coined term composed of UNTOC and UNCAC principal concepts, but it is becoming the predominant manifestation of corruption and organized crime nexus at the international level. And we should devote much more attention to that than it was in the past. Of course, it is very important for all of us to understand crime and criminal. However, understanding anti-crime is even more important, because the two go together, right? There is a sort of action-reaction relationship. But for social change and policy use perspectives, the anti-crime merits particular attention. Law, law enforcement, politics, civil society, and academia involvement. Now, as I mentioned, we have these international normative and policy platforms. The two conventions that I have mentioned, UNTOC and UNCAC, represent these normative criminal justice-based platforms for the prevention and control of transnational organized crime and transnational organized corruption. On the other hand, we have a developmental platform, which is represented by the Sustainable Development Goals 2030, particularly Goal 16, 16.4, 16.5, 16.6, which all talk about the targets regarding significant reduction in all forms of organized crime and substantial reduction of corruption and bribery in all their forms. So these actually mix between two normative platforms, which are mandatory for all member states that have ratified them, and another political development platform, which has been adopted by the General Assembly of the UN, represent, I would say, the basis from which international community deals with the nexus between organized crime and corruption at the international level. Just shortly to remind you that UNTOC, or as known as Palermo Convention, because it was adopted in Palermo, my Italian friends, of course, and others know the meaning. This is a very symbolical, of course, title, Palermo Convention. It is in force already from 2003. It has 191 countries that have ratified it. So it is universal practically. And it has also 3 supplementary protocols on human trafficking, on smuggling of migrants, and on and the firearms protocol. The second one, United Nations Convention Against Corruption, Merida Convention, as it was adopted in Mexico, Merida, is in force since 2015, and it has 187 states that have ratified it. So that is also almost universal. Both of these conventions establish certain mandatory offenses, which means that the countries that have ratified these conventions have an obligation to incorporate those conventions in their domestic legislation, basically in criminal code or special criminal laws. And these are of several of them. I don't want to go through all of them. UNCAC, differently from UNTOC, has 2 categories of offenses, mandatory offenses. So those that countries that have ratified UNCAC must incorporate in domestic legislation. And the so-called optional offenses, these are those that are of facultative nature. In other words, countries may, but do not have to incorporate them into the national legislation. All in all, when we look at these offenses from the 2 mega conventions, we find even explicitly 3 categories which are the same. One is corruption, another one is money laundering, and the third one is obstruction of justice. These 3 categories of offenses are present both in Palermo and in Merida Convention, which of course points out already to certain similarities that exist between these 2. International cooperation in both conventions, because these are international conventions and their main purpose is actually to facilitate international cooperation against organized crime and against corruption. So the international cooperation category in both conventions is almost the same, with the novelty in the corruption convention, and that regards international recovery of assets. This is an innovative approach to be even further promoted and used. And this, however, concept and instrument is not present in UNTOC. Now, what we have as a common features between these 2 mega conventions, as I already mentioned, are universality of ratification, criminalization, at least of the 3 categories of offenses, money laundering, corruption, and obstruction of justice. Both have chapters or articles devoted exclusively to prevention of organized crime and corruption. Both have very well developed category of international cooperation and mutual legal assistance, including, as I mentioned, international asset recovery. Both have established their own governance arrangements, and one of them is called COP. Luis, don't be confused. This is Conference of Parties, and COSP, this is Conference of State Parties. There is just one S that makes them different, but they're the same. These are actually all the countries that have ratified the convention. Of course, those that have signed can also participate in that. And both of these conventions have adopted their own review mechanisms. Now, the conference, the governance arrangements that we have today, as I mentioned, COP and COSPs, have very similar mandates, and they are held in alternative years. For example, COP, that is UNTOC, was held last time in 2020, and this year it will be held in October in Vienna, while UNCAC, COSP, was held in 2021 in December in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and the next one in 2023 will be in United States. So they have these very similar governance arrangements. I would also wanted to point out that they have also the review mechanisms. Review mechanisms for both conventions are based on peer review, that is, other countries that are reviewing the performance of subject matter countries. There is a very well-developed mechanism for the selection of countries and the rounds through which it is done. But I must say that Corruption Convention has started with review mechanism application much earlier than UNTOC, and actually UNCAC is already at the end, almost at the end of the second cycle of the review. UNTOC review mechanism, unfortunately, was adopted almost 18 years. That is, when the convention became mature, the review mechanism was adopted with a lot of delay. And I must make here a political note of observation. Both of these conventions were adopted in 2000, in the time that I call the golden age of international cooperation. It was still the time after the fall of Berlin Wall, with all the consequences. Review mechanisms were made after that, already in a very much changed and tense, strained international atmosphere. And that is one of the reasons why it took 18 years for the review mechanism of UNTOC to be adopted. However, it was adopted, both of these, and it started already. So tomorrow actually will be the first constructive dialogue, which includes also civil society in Vienna, about the implementation of the firearms protocol. That is one of the protocols of Palermo Convention. Both review mechanisms share many common characteristics, but I must say that both of them fall very much behind the human rights review mechanism, UPR, particularly when it comes to the role and position of the civil society. Again, it is a reflection of the changed political situation and geopolitics of today. However, what I have to say is that there is a need for much more cross-fertilization and mutual reliance between UNTOC and UNCAC, in particular, review mechanisms. On a substantive point, of view, I must say that UNTOC Palermo, so the organized crime convention, has shown more opening to the new phenomena. For example, in the last COP has adopted 3 very important resolutions which are recognizing environmental crime, manufacturing and trafficking in falsified medical products, and combating and crimes against cultural property as pertaining to the category of transnational organized crime. This is a substantive, I would say, novelty, because these crimes really did not exist and do not exist in Palermo Convention. On the other hand side, Merida Convention, the Corruption Convention, has not shown clear signs of opening towards new forms of transnational corruption, such as above-mentioned organized corruption and grand corruption. It has altered for a need to increase anti-corruption awareness and capacity to deal with increased corruption threat in urgent situations such as COVID. And this was one of the messages from Sharm el-Sheikh COSP in December 2021. In January 2022, the works of an ad hoc committee started to elaborate a comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communications technologies for criminal purposes, known as UN Cybercrime Convention. So these works started, and I think this is an excellent opportunity towards furthering efforts to integrate global responses to global crime challenges and towards more effective integration and international cooperation. So we have international cooperation based on the same principles and instruments of prevention and control regarding transnational organized crime, corruption, money laundering, assets recovery, and the abuse of new technologies and information for criminal purposes. And this is the potentially most powerful international crime governance response. What we have today is actually, unfortunately, a divorce between corruption, between Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and Corruption Convention. They have their own governance bodies, their own review mechanisms, and they do not talk to each other. This is very much, very much lowering the level of the effectiveness and fruitfulness in international cooperation against transnational organized crime and corruption. So we are actually lacking strategic and integrated global crime governance. And this is the future, in my view. We have to devote much more efforts to transnational organized crime and corruption and technological information challenges, which do request an integrated and strategic international crime governance response. Molto obrigado.
Mr. Ambassador Ugi, thank you so much for your brilliant presentation and for explaining the not so easy dialogue between UNTOC and UNCAC. Thank you so much for having us the honor to be with us. So I'm passing the floor to Professor Svetoslav. It's not easy to summarize his curriculum. It has extensive background in international diplomacy, governmental, parliamentarian, and academic sectors, significant experience in management, communication, financial, and administrative oversight, strong performance in leadership, diplomatic experience as ambassador, permanent representative of Republic of Bulgaria to the United Nations, OSCE, and other international organizations in Vienna. Professor Svetoslav, which is an inviting scholar at our university during May. So we'll have other opportunities to have you with us in some other lectures. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marisa. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to participate in this high-level forum. And it's a pleasure for me to spend some more time with your students at also your university. And thank you very much for your kind invitation. I don't know if how we could. Yeah. Okay. This is my presentation. I focus it on the role of the OSCE in preventing and combating corruption. A few words about the history of OSCE. It was initiated in 1972. We called it the Helsinki process, which started on 22nd of November 1972 and ended at on 8th of June 1974. Okay. It was happening in Helsinki. Preparatory conversations took place in order to found the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. This was the first name of the organization. And in the beginning, till 1995, the organization met twice per year in 2 sessions, spring and autumn session. Then the transition of the organization from conference to organization was initiated in the summit in Budapest in December 1994, when the participants decided to rename the organization and effective from 1st of January 1995, and its name became the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. OSCE has 3 dimensions: a wide range of security issues, including arms control, confidence and security building measures, human and national minorities' rights, democratization, strategies for police actions, and fight against terrorism, economic and environmental actions. There are 3 main dimensions: political, environmental, and economic, where anti-corruption is included, and human rights. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is uniquely situated and driven by its core values to combat corruption in all its forms, yet it remains an underused resources in the fight against corruption. The organization is consensus-based organization. This means that the decisions are made by an unanimous agreement from all 57 participating states. And this ensures that when the OSCE acts, it does so with support and input from all of its members. However, it also predictably leads to decisions being derailed semi-frequently, often due to extra news reasons for spoiler efforts by members like Russia, which recently blocked the OSCE annual human rights conference, for example. You could see here the OSCE strategic papers for improving international security. I'll not go through it. You see that regularly the organization approved different documents regarding the work of the organization when it was a consensus. You see that the strategic document, the last strategic document, is from 2003. I was ambassador to OSCE from 2012 till 2019, when it was very difficult to have consensus having Russia on board, for example. And you see that unfortunately lately there are not so many strategic documents. And you see here the structure and bodies of the OSCE. The political bodies include OSCE summits, ministerial council summits. They meet very rare, let's say every 10 years. Ministerial council took place in December every year. The OSCE chairmanship, this is the state chairs the OSCE in a specific year. We have the permanent council, which meets once per week. The OSCE Forum for Security Cooperation, and the executive bodies like the Secretary General, the Secretariat, Conflict Prevention Center. The director of this Conflict Prevention Center is also deputy of the Secretary General. And we have also the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, based in Warsaw, the Special Representative and Coordinator for the Fighting Trafficking in Human Beings, and the High Commissioner on National Minorities, the OSCE Representative on Freedom of Media, and there's some other structures. And we have here also among the other structures and institutions, the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE and the Court for Conciliation and Arbitration and the Minsk Group. Regarding the Parliamentary Assembly, I would like to mention that this is a political body parallel to other OSCE structures in which lawmakers, these are the parliamentarians, from participating states meet for discussion and to debate resolutions. It operates on majority vote rather than consensus. This is the difference between the Parliamentary Assembly and the OSCE Permanent Council or Ministerial Council. Supplementary items are resolutions which can be raised in committee by individual party members and later voted on by the entire assembly, while resolutions do not carry over as direct orders to the OSCE. They do express the unified will of parliamentary members and serve to prompt the OSCE into enacting organizational change. Here we have the OSCE field operations for prevention of conflicts. There are different types of field operations, and through these OSCE missions in different participating states, OSCE also work in the field of anti-corruption through the OSCE missions. Here we have the other type of field missions for post-war recovery, like the missions in Central Asia, Western Balkans, and after 2014 we have one more mission in Ukraine, not the regular one OSCE mission to Ukraine. We have a special monitoring mission responsible for Donbass and Crimea as well. Regarding corruption, the OSCE participating states have recognized that corruption represents one of the major impediments to the prosperity and sustainable development of the participating states, that undermines their stability and security and threatens the OSCE's shared values. This was adopted as a ministerial council decision during the Bulgarian chairmanship in 2004. And we have three pillars recognized by OSCE. This is the capacity building, exchange of best practices, and awareness raising. Here I would like to mention the role of the second dimension in OSCE, economic and environmental dimension. Economic and environmental stability are fundamentals lasting peace. Recognize this, OSCE states have long cooperation through the OSCE on issues as crucial to our common security as good practice, good governance, fighting corruption, and environmental stewardship. Taken together, these efforts make up the second or economic and environmental dimension of the organization's three broad areas of work. The OSCE undertakes a variety of activities in its economic and environmental dimension. For example, the OSCE provides regular opportunities for representatives of OSCE governments to meet, exchange views, and share best practices on economic and environmental matters. These meetings often also include civil society and private sectors experts whose outside perspectives and new ideas enrich the dimensions. The latest level meeting of this type in the OSCE Economic and Environmental Forum, which convenes once a year in Prague in the Czech Republic to develop recommendations for action on focus issues and to foster the political engagements needed to agree on them. The OSCE also works on economic and environmental issues on the ground through its field operations, as I mentioned already, providing expertise and support to local institutions across the region. The last year topic was also reviewing the achievements by participating states in the field of corruption and the efforts, the anti-corruption efforts as well. And what is the role of OSCE in preventing and combating corruption? Based on the mandate given by its participating states, the OSCE supports national authorities in implementing commitments under relevant international instruments and standards to prevent and combat corruption, in particular the United Nations Convention Against Corruption and the OECD's Istanbul Anti-Corruption Action Plan. The OSCE also provides a platform for dialogue on political and security issues, and it's unequivocally positioned to support cooperation among its participating states in implementing and enforcing anti-corruption models and mechanisms. The OSCE work in anti-corruption is guided by the 2003 Maastricht OSCE strategy document for the economic and environmental dimension, as well as a relevant Ministerial Council decision of 2004 in Sofia, 2014 in Brussels, in Basel, 2016 in Hamburg, as well as the 2012 OSCE Dublin Declaration. The OSCE anti-corruption programs and activities, the OSCE supports concrete anti-corruption programs and activities through capacity building and awareness raising events, scoping and advisory missions, as well as activities aimed at strengthening institutional and legislative framework. You could read some other activities. I see that there is no time. Here, just briefly, you could see from the presentation the most important anti-corruption programs and activities, like promoting the ratification and implementation of the UN Convention Against Corruption and the Financial Action Task Force's recommendations, to improve the national anti-corruption, anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing frameworks, conducting capacity building, developing mechanisms of information sharing to more effectively identify and etc. More programs and activities you could see in this slide. Again, promoting, providing tools and guidance for policymakers, producing policy recommendations and publications. And the last is to cooperate with different international organizations and stakeholders like UNODC, OECD, and IACA. This is my conclusion about the role in general of OSCE in security issues, but I could read the conclusion regarding the anti-corruption issues. Corruption poses a significant threat to security and stability. It undermines democracy, diminishes the role of law, and hinders social and economic development by diverting much needed investments from welfare and infrastructure to the pockets of corrupted individuals. Widespread corruption can lead to general public dissatisfaction towards state institutions, disillusion with the government, which can result in unrest and instability. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. Now is Professor Joseph Pozsgai-Alvarez. Professor Pozsgai-Alvarez holds a PhD in political science from the University of Tsukuba, Japan, and position of associate professor at the School of Human Science of Osaka University. He is the founder of the Japan Network of Anti-Corruption Researchers and the editor of the Politics of Anti-Corruption Agencies in Latin America, published by Routledge in 2021. He was also the co-creator of the ACA Digital Library and online database of corruption-related literature hosted by the NGO Global Integrity. Professor, is your turn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me well. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so I will share my slides here. I believe that we're running maybe a little late, so I'm going to try not to take too much time. And I will also like to leave more time for Professor Albanese, who I'm sure has more interesting things to say than I do. I only have a handful of slides that I want to show you here today. I was very glad to be invited to talk about the transnational aspect of anti-corruption, because even though the community or the field of corruption or anti-corruption, I should say, have had significant watershed moments in the past 30 years, such as the funding of Transparency International, the signing of the UNCAC, the launch of the Open Government Partnership, even more recently in 2016, 2017, the adoption of the ISO 37001 for anti-bribery administrative systems. I think that what we're seeing today over the last couple of years, and especially right now, is probably the period with more hectic international activities of cooperation to deal with the issue of corruption. We had the White House Summit in December of last year, having as one of the three main pillars that fight against corruption. Earlier in 2021, we had the US Special Session on corruption. And of course, now because of the new geopolitical realities in Eastern Europe, the war between Russia and Ukraine, many main actors around the world are dealing now with the issue of money laundering. So I believe this is a perfect moment to talk about where we are at this moment in terms of the transnational aspects or the transnational nature of corruption. So what you're seeing here, and please bear with me a little bit because I know that this may sound exceedingly academic. But over the last 15 to 20 years, we have seen a substantial growth on the number of publications every year coming out on the subject of corruption. So what you're seeing here right now is a frequency table based on a set of around 8,000 publications on anti-corruption garnered for a few years now. And as you see, every year we continue seeing more publications, a lot more attention on the issue of corruption. And this is not just a matter of volume, but we also see a multiplication in the areas of study, in the fields of study that also start approaching the issue of studying corruption. The main two ones being traditionally economics and political science. And of course, we can also mention sociology around there, but business, psychology, and even medicine and computer science have been growing, or the level of attention that they pay to the issue of corruption has been growing also very recently. So it's a very exciting time to be researching and discussing corruption. We all know it's a very interdisciplinary subject. And finally, after many, many years, it seems that interdisciplinary dimension of corruption is being more embraced by at least academicians, but hopefully also by practitioners. And I said a few minutes ago that please bear with me, because I hope that it will make sense why I'm talking about this issue of how academics discuss or think about corruption and what is the real world application of these academic discussions. Corruption, traditionally speaking, is not very well defined. The definitions are very complex. Many legal documents prefer not to define corruption, as the UNCAC, for example. And instead of a clear definition of corruption, what we have is a laundry list of different criminal types that are considered to be either part of corruption or related to corruption, right? And here we have, of course, bribery, but also money laundering, obstruction of justice, nepotism, clientelism, voter fraud, etc., etc. The problem is, however, that if we consider corruption to mean many different things, the way that we accept or fight against corruption will depend on the type of corruption that we are affected by in our specific context, and by how people in different countries perceive the dangers of that specific form of corruption. So a couple of years ago, a colleague and I performed this survey across a number of countries in let's say, major countries in different parts of the world. We on purpose tried to stay a little away of OECD countries because we wanted to engage more in countries where normally we would think that certain parts of the population have higher tolerance of corruption, meaning they are more willing to accept either petty bribery or accept corruption in their political system. And we asked hundreds of people about how they felt in different instances, contexts, without actually using the word corruption, just describing scenarios that were reflective of typical cases of embezzlement, of clientelism, or of conflict of interest, and see how they felt about this. And a couple of things stand out in this result that you're seeing right now in this slide. One is that there's certainly some countries that seem to be more tolerant of corruption than others. The least tolerant countries in our set was Spain, and the most tolerant was Indonesia. However, not all forms of corruption are equally tolerable. Some of them are considered to be more damaging or less morally acceptable, whereas other types of corruption were more morally unacceptable. And also, depending on the type of corruption, some countries would have a lower image of that specific type of corruption. For example, bribery affecting a public office compared to bribery affecting a private office compared to other countries. And this is not that surprising when we consider that over the past decades, the types of activities or behaviors that are criminalized in relation to corruption has also been evolving. Things that were accepted in relation to international business and could even be tax deductible, even in European countries, stopped being so after a European convention in the late 1990s. So as our understanding of what corruption is continued to evolve, also our ethical opinion about it continues to be evolved. So why is this important? corruption is very much connected to power. The problem is that different countries or different societies understand the distribution or the acceptable distribution of power in different ways. Corruption is very much connected with the idea of something that is entrusted to someone and that someone abuses that power that is entrusted to them, right? This is the more traditional definition of corruption. However, not every country has the same opinion about if the power is being entrusted or is it just being rewarded because of the position of the individual that is receiving that power. For example, lobbying in the US is more acceptable than in many other Latin American countries. The idea of if the president or a prime minister can employ members of their family can be more accepted in some countries and less accepted in others. So again, the question is, when we deal with public officials, the amount of power that they hold and that they manage, how much of it is being entrusted by the population and how much of it is being used as a reward because they end up winning in the game of politics. Now, if we accept that different societies perceive this distribution of power in different ways, and we start comparing it or looking at the distribution of levels of corruption according to the most reputable and the most also oldest measurement of corruption that we have today, that of Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, some interesting ideas start to emerge about maybe what are some of the potential results that we see that over the last 20 years, even though we continue pouring more and more financial resources and human resources in the fight against corruption, it seems that we haven't made enough progress in this field. What you're seeing here is not very surprising. Most of the global north, Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand are considered to be less corrupt countries compared to the global south, Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia. However, these images of corruption that we tend to use to rank countries or to distribute resources across different regions responds to a very traditional understanding of what corruption is. The Transparency International's index was not meant to actually provide a tool for public officials to address the issue of corruption. Because if you know, for example, that Canada is less corrupt than Mexico, that doesn't give a lot of tools for Mexican officials to adopt the correct policies. What it does, however, is create political pressure for leaders to do something about this problem. So in that sense, it was very successful, but over the last 25 years, we have kind of failed to move beyond this and actually start measuring in a more clear way the different types of corruption and their frequency and their impact in different countries. Why is this important? What you're seeing here compared to the previous image is a network mapping of links between different jurisdictions in terms that is relevant for money laundering. So this is the geographic structure of shell companies as informed to us by the evidence of the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. So these are only two sets of a growing sets of leaked documents that have been appearing over the last years. And what we know now, and it was suspected before, is that many jurisdictions that, according to Transparency International, are considered to be the least corrupt, actually have a very big role to play when we consider not corruption as a domestic problem, but as an issue of transnational networks. Okay, so what you're seeing here is that prominent countries such as the US, UK territories, Spain, Brazil, some other European countries as well, become a lot more prominent and more important for the study of corruption than what Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index indicated before. Now, if we look at a different index, very much connected to the issue of money laundering, we find this of Financial Secrecy Index. That ranks countries based on how easy it is or how friendly their legal structure is towards the creation of shell companies and the hiding of assets, either legal or illegal. And in here, we kind of start seeing an inverse relation to that map of Transparency International, right? Countries that we find at the top of the ranking include the United States, Switzerland, Singapore, Luxembourg, Japan, Netherlands, many of the countries that usually we consider to be role models in international fora in terms of what are the correct forms of anti-corruption institutions and policies, right? And if we were to compare each one side by side, we find that actually about half of those countries that are at the top of the financial secrecy index are also considered to be some of the lowest corrupt countries in the world by one of the most important measurements of corruption, as I mentioned, corruption perception index. And if I were to extend this list by another 10 spots, we would also include here the United States and other Western countries. So what I'm trying to say with this is that the way that we have understood the fight against corruption is very much based on an idea of how corruption looks like in the global south, in developing countries. And because of this, our attention has been focusing on forms of corruption that are prominent or that are systemic in poorer countries. Not to say that they are not important, because they certainly are. However, for most of this time, we have been missing the other side of the coin. The importance of institutions that enable transnational corruption networks. So if I had to summarize what I've been talking so far, I will say that traditionally, or our traditional understanding of corruption has been primarily domestic. It has dealt with issues of bribery. Even the Sustainable Development Goal in its point 16.5 deals with indicators of corruption that relate only to bribery, and mostly to bribery of low-level and mid-level public officials, the type of corruption that is usually found in the global south. Traditional corruption is also often functional, because many of the citizens, many of the people living in these societies usually reply that although they morally reject corruption, they find that in their day-to-day life, they don't have many options but to engage in corruption themselves. And so because of this, corruption in this traditional sense is economically inefficient, of course, but it's not necessarily extractive, because most of the money that gets engaged in corruption, traditionally speaking, has stayed within the borders of that country. Now, let's compare that to the issue of transnational corruption, which is in contemporary days, perhaps the most important type of corruption for us to tackle at this moment, because we know very little about it, and we certainly don't have the international organizations to deal with it. It is largely transnational, meaning that its main actors are not just grounded or rooted to the domestic environment, but even though the corruption or the extraction of resources illicitly may begin within one country, it normally moves away from that territory, gets laundered somewhere else, and perhaps it ends up being parked in a third country, but it usually doesn't come back. Because of this, it is highly dysfunctional, and it is also highly extractive. So it's not just inefficient, but what we're seeing is that many of these countries in the global south actually get these resources stolen from them, because they end up being laundered in other jurisdictions and being used to buy real estate and luxury items, and creating these or being parked in so-called tax havens that are not just the Caribbean islands and the Bahamas and the Cayman Islands, as traditionally we consider, but most of them today are in some American states, in the UK, Luxembourg, and in many other considered to be higher income jurisdictions. So because of this, I wanted to use today's opportunity to stress the fact that when we talk about corruption, especially if we want to talk about transnational corruption, it is potentially more important and more valuable, and certainly more efficient, to stop thinking domestically in terms of the issues that are happening or taking place only within one country's borders, but then instead focus on these transnational networks. And I wanted to just leave you then with that idea. Thank you very much for your attention.
Joseph, thank you so much for your presentation and your extensive academic work towards corruption, which is inspiring to all of us. And it certainly was to our students here. And with no further notice, Professor Jay Albanese, criminologist from Virginia Commonwealth, just coming from the United States. A great opportunity and an honor to have you with us. Professor Jay, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much, Marisa, and it's certainly a pleasure to be here. And it was wonderful of you to build a whole new campus and building for us to attend. The building is gorgeous. We really like the new campus, and we certainly appreciate the generous hospitality that's been extended to us here and the sponsorship of the UNODC as well. I am going to be brief, but I want to hit some important issues that I think are important for the students present here and those online, as well as my colleagues, on ways I think we ought to be thinking now in the future. Because obviously, if we're going to spend our time, we want to spend our time on the biggest problems of the world, right? All of us want to make the world a better place. If you don't, you're in the wrong conference. But then the question is, well, how do you focus your effort? Where do you start? And here's one way to look at it. There's groups around the world that rank the largest problems because we have big problems, resources are limited. How should we prioritize what we focus upon? Well, the best known lists are the UN Sustainable Development Goals there on the left side of the slide. They're important because they represent a consensus of the world, right? Of 195 countries in the world, 193 are members of the UN. So this is the consensus selection of what the member states of the United Nations, which is the world, see as the biggest problems facing us today. Well, when you look at this list, you say, well, these issues are all over the place, right? From poverty and hunger, gender, education, all kinds of things, climate, justice. How are you supposed to make a difference with these big problems? Well, if you look carefully and do a little homework on any one of these problems, I think it can be said that, and for any of these world's largest problems, they were all either created or made worse by decisions of humans, and that many of these decisions resulted from either ignorance, selfishness, or corruption. That's how these got to be bigger problems than they started out to be. So the common theme among all of these, and that's why the theme of this conference is so important, is that, well, despite the differences among the substantive focus of all the problems in the world, corruption lies at a core of many of them. So I have some good news and bad news. First, some good news. When you look globally, higher levels of education are correlated with lower levels of corruption. And there's all kinds of empirical data to show that, as that graph shows, the line shows. That education makes a difference, right? Countries with higher levels of education have more people committed to civil liberties, more aware of international standards, and less tolerant of government repression. So years of schooling is correlated with corruption. Another good news, the content of education is crucial. If you're looking for something to tell your friends, instead of watching the news and say, God, the news is all bad, well, there's some good news. Here's some good news. Global illiteracy has declined substantially, planet-wide. Just remarkable. Now, unfortunately, graph covers about 200 years, but I put the line in the graph to show post-World War II with the advent of the UN and a globalized effort to improve global problems, dramatic drop in the number of people who cannot read or write. Obviously, if you cannot read or write, your ability to affect your life and your community and interact with the world declines substantially. So this is sort of a key indicator. So this is good news, all right? Okay, one more slide of good news. There's more good news. The percent of the population globally that have no formal education has correspondingly also dropped. We have more people going to school planet-wide than at any point in human history. This is good, right? So more people are getting education, more people are able to read and write, and thereby exercise control over their individual circumstances. So there is some reason to be happy. Okay, but there is a problem. The problem is corruption. When you look at corruption trends here over the last 20 some odd years on these graphs, this is from Transparency International. They find, this is their quote, a continued failure to significantly control corruption is contributing to a crisis in democracy around the world. The data shows, despite some progress, most countries are failing to make serious inroads against corruption. So what are we to make of this? Literacy is better planet-wide. Schooling is better planet-wide. Corruption is worse. All right, how do we make a difference given that sort of thing? Well, first, of course, corruption is not some vague notion. Some of the previous speakers have talked about this. I will not spend time on it. There's some fascinating empirical studies. But if you look at the behaviors that constitute corruption, it's a small number of behaviors. Normally, it's under 10. This study I've cited here looked at hundreds of corruption cases. They said there's really only 8 kinds of behaviors that we're actually talking about. So when you say, oh, corruption is such a global, behemoth of a concept, well, no, not really. When you drill down, there's really a limited number of behaviors that constitute corruption. So the question is, why aren't we making better progress against corruption? Well, okay, if education's getting better, but corruption is not, what are we doing wrong? Well, as the slide says, most education, when you look at the curriculum, focuses on the usual things: history, math, science, language. There's much less emphasis, or in many cases, no emphasis on how to evaluate facts to make decisions. This, which of course is the subject matter of ethics and civic life. History, math, science, language, these are important things. These are skill building things. These are raising levels of competence, very important. But your ability to make decisions, principled decisions, is looking forward, and not enough of that is part of the educational process in most places. And that's because all the facts you know about history, math, science, language, or anything else do not help you make a decision moving forward, all right? So this is an extremely important thing. Too much education looks backward, not enough looks forward. I have a quote there from Aristotle, but too often it's like one of my favorite quotes: we're behaving like patients who listen attentively to their doctor, but do none of the things that they're asked to do. So the question becomes, what is it about the content of education that might be able to improve its relationship with corruption around the world? So what I argue with here in this diagram, I'm arguing that, well, we need more people making ethical decisions moving forward. Every day you're presented with choices. You decide to go to class, you decide to brush your teeth, you decide to open the door for the person behind you, and all the way through workplace to decisions, how you treat others. This is the basics for ethics, right? Ethics begins with etiquette and works its way up. So how do we get more people to create an ethical disposition, all right, where people have an ethical principled outlook and see their obligation toward others? If you can do that, then that could directly impact corruption because people are more resistant to making unethical decisions, more resistant to slamming the door in the face of the person behind you, more resistant to not caring about people in need around you, more resistant to doing the selfish thing, instead doing the selfless thing. And with ethical education, you're less tolerant for corrupt behavior on the part of others. And that's very important for an informed electorate, informed citizens, to be intolerant of corruption by those in positions of authority. And then when you do that, then people are starting to do just acts. And you can get, you improve measures of justice because there are less people engaging in self-seeking behavior. So just a couple other things here. We have made a number of notable instances of progress, especially over the last 20 years. Ugi and Svetoslav talked persuasively about some of the global initiatives. UN Convention Against Corruption, UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, OECD, the World Bank, OSCE. These are all international organizations pushing things in the right direction. For me, when you look at them, many of them on the left, they work on structural reforms to reduce opportunities for corruption. Structural reforms like changing laws, changing procedures, changing administrative regulations, enhancing oversight. All these kinds of things are extremely important. They're extremely important. But what they don't address is what about people who are motivated to just go after their own self-interest? What about people, well, who don't care if building a new school that I pocket 100,000 euros on the side? I'm in it for my, so the point is structural reforms make it more difficult to engage in public or private misbehavior, but it doesn't take away the motivation from people who are acting corruptly. But if you add to our education and training process what people need to do, what are ethical principles? Most people don't even know what they are. And what are ethical, how do you make ethical choices in difficult circumstances? How do you give a principled response in a difficult circumstance? A boss asks you to do something that doesn't appear to be legal to you. What do you do? Though these are important issues that everybody faces. Anyway, then you will get to ethical decisions. So structural reform is important, but it isn't enough. You need behavioral change as well. And the UNODC Education for Justice, which Marco led for several years at the UN, has developed some fabulous course materials for the primary, secondary, and university level education around the world. You know, these are all important steps, but, and of course, one of the modules is on ethics and integrity, another one on anti-corruption. But my point is structural reforms are important, ethics, education, and training as important. So where does this get us? Well, we started with talking about the world's largest problems. We can identify them. And then you say, well, God, I'm interested in climate change, but I don't know anything about natural science or earth science or meteorology. Well, if you're going to be interested in climate change, for example, well, maybe it's time to take a few courses in those areas. But more important, the issues is, why hasn't there been better global action or even local action against it? And that's a topic that interests you. Well, that's when you look at, well, how are decisions made? What are people doing, you know, locally and nationally and internationally to address the problem. The point here is at the bottom. I mean, if you want to make a difference in the world, you have to address the largest problems. And my takeaway point is corruption is the one thing that all of the largest problems in the world have in common. So if we go after corruption, we can impact all of these other problems. And my last slide. You see on the left, again, the summary of the listing of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Arguably, it's as good a list as any of the largest problems facing the planet today. And if you go up that arrow from the left to the right, more than structural change is needed to reduce corruption, because you're not addressing people motivated to be corrupt through structural change. You need to do something else. So you need to address the issue of corrupt people who will find their way around laws and regulations and processes. How do we reduce the number of corrupt people, self-interested people who care about personal interest and not public interest? Ethics education and training is a way to do this. And it is remarkable. I teach ethics among other classes, very heavily scenario-based. But once you learn principles of decision-making and give people scenario after scenario of how do you make a decision in difficult circumstances, people start thinking forward and they start recognizing ethical decisions when they present themselves. And they tend to be more thoughtful and act less in self-interest and more in the interest of others. And last, civil society, of course, as well as states, but NGOs, FBOs, academia, the private sector can all be sources for this change in the workplace, in the schools, and elsewhere. So my takeaway is, if we're going to make a change in the world, let's focus on the largest problems. And I'm arguing that corruption is the largest problem in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jay, for your brilliant presentation, as always. So I'm opening the floor now before lunchtime and releasing you real soon. If you have any questions for any of our speakers, please. Oh, students, I'm so happy. So if a microphone is going to you. One there.
I would like to bring a new subject to the table, if it's possible. I think corruption is all about the money, right? So nowadays, with the technologies like blockchain, NFTs, or cryptocurrency, how can you trace the money, you know? And if we cannot trace the money, how can we take legal measures? In that, it's my question for you all.
Thank you. Great question. The paper trail, the old problem of paper trail. Does anyone want to answer our student? Luís Carrilho, please. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And the question, the student didn't say the name, but it's a very pertinent question. And on that, I will link more with the police challenges nowadays. There were very recently two very important World Police Summits, one in Dubai, interestingly, and the other one in South Korea, where, of course, the use of artificial intelligence, but also the multipolarity in terms of either the cybercrime, cyber defense, and the tools that the police or that the countries or that the partnership between the different countries have with private companies to make exactly the trail, to trace the money. And clearly it came very high in terms of the discussions that, of course, first, international police cooperation or international cooperation at all, it is essential. It is also important that on this topic, that the use of technology and in terms of innovation, because clearly every day there are new challenges coming, and the criminals, unfortunately, they are always or they try to be one step ahead. But I believe that that main challenge is exactly that one. International police cooperation, there are a lot of very good companies, and as it was said by a very interesting by my friend, the panelists, the speakers, really very interesting, that is everyone has a role to play on this. And clearly the police, being the United Nations police, of course, it was spoken more about the SDGs. And as our Secretary General said, during, unfortunately, the pandemic, some even of the goals, they went backwards, and it is important that we are all committed for that. And once again, partnership is key, and this Congress is a good example in terms of highlighting for the topic of corruption and to fight it. Thank you.
Thank you, Luís. Giving the floor to Ugi, who wants to answer. Thank you, Ugi.
Yes, thank you, Marisa. I just wanted to make one comment. Of course, that we are all concerned about illicit use and corruption and all these things, and particularly now of the communication technologies. And I would like to draw your attention. I mentioned that there is now the work on the new mega convention on cybercrime. And there are some issues which also have to do with corruption and paper tracing, et cetera, and this is human rights issues. And we sometimes tend to forget, because we are very much concerned about effective prevention and effective control and remedies, that there are certain principles of human rights that need to be respected, nonetheless. And I think this is something that civil society is very much aware of, but governments are less willing to pay attention to these things. Because we have here, I would say, maybe Jay can explain that better, a clash between certain ethical values and the values of managing effectively problems or challenges. And this is also what we are facing in terms of international cooperation against corruption, organized crime, and now also cybercrime. So I just wanted to make this sort of footnote, if you like, to be aware that we have to strike a balance between efficient domestic interventions and efficient international cooperation on one hand side, and respect for the human rights and the rules of international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ugi. I will give the floor to Marco, who also wants to state some words to our student. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you. I don't want to hijack this panel naturally, but I want to first of all congratulate the previous speakers of the panel, and also regarding the question of the aspects linked with financial illicit flows, which are actually the epicenter both of transnational organized crime groups, but also the corruption overall objectives to generate capitals, revenues, and illicit revenues. In that sense, I think one of the entry points is look at assets, which are the end goal of creating illicit financial flows. You accept corruption and you are being corrupted or participate in corruption to obtain capacity to buy assets. So one of the angles, besides what the UN Police Advisor Luís Carrilho mentioned, is also focusing the assets, because even in cryptocurrencies or decentralized digital currencies, they have the end goal not to stay in the cyberspace, but to be used to buy assets. So actually using the provisions of the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime and the UNCAC for recovering assets and actually reintroduce those assets to the natural system on the stage to be fighting against corruption or transnational organized crime is actually the entry point that we could be seen as an action to actually trace and reintroduce those assets to the regular market and recover those assets, which can be bought by digital currencies or normal currencies. Of course, both conventions have the provisions on cooperation in criminal justice matters and also the recovering of those assets, which could also complement some of the state actions to address the revenues of both transnational crime and also corruption actions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Even if sometimes the dialogue between all of the convention is not as easy.
True.
But that's another problem. We have another student here with a question.
Professor Marisa,
Sorry, yes, Professor Margarida?
can I just tell a small story?
Of course, of course.
Just a small story told yesterday by our responsible for the, I'm sorry, I have echo in my voice. I will try to speak. Yes, now I don't have echo. Yesterday, our responsible for the brigade police investigation on corruption crimes told us something interesting. He was to pick up all the computers in a bank. Then he went there to the room where the computers were on the table. And he said, I want to take all the computers to the police department. And someone told him, no, you can't do that because the computers belong to the island, to the Cayman Islands. And he said, I don't care. They are here in Lisbon, so I will take them. Just this story.
So our student here now, thank you, Professor Margarida.
I want to ask a question about, well, if there is a higher source, a higher entity that controls, let's say, corruption overall, like the UN, what kind of people does that structure have to constitute? What kind of higher moral people can there be that I should trust, and why should I trust them? Because, you know, if people are corrupt by nature, it's really hard for someone to be moral all the time. I doubt everyone is moral all the time. Well, and there's proof, there's empirical proof of that. Well, the massacres of the 20th century, of course. I hate to be the one to bring out Hitler, but I have to be the one. So, well, if a person, let's say Hitler or some of his, somebody that works for him comes up to you and tells you, come kill with me or you will die. I think these are some of the magnitude of the problems that some people and the UN and those entities have to deal with. So what do you do in that situation is really hard, not just to sacrifice yourself for that cause. I don't know what kind of person you have to be to actually sacrifice your own life for a cause. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this is a Jay question. How to be ethical.
Yeah, we were hoping for a much easier question.
Yes.
But that isn't to say that that is a valid question. Two things. First of all, you bring up probably the most difficult of all ethical questions. And one of the things I have my students do is you go through scenarios. There was a movie 20 years ago called Return to Paradise. Vince Vaughn and a few others. They go on vacation to Malaysia. One of them is caught smoking hashish, gets a very long prison sentence. The other people leave. And they were just on vacation. They weren't close friends. Anyway, the story goes, the court in Singapore said, you're going to get a life sentence or some very long sentence unless the people who were with you come back and own up to their involvement, and the sentence will be reduced to 5 years or something. So will the people then come back? See, this is an ultimate ethical question. To what extent will I sacrifice my own freedom for the benefit of others? So those are big, important questions, but you resolve those of the same principles. Even Aristotle, the founder of virtue ethics, right? And he lived about 300 years before Jesus, right? So these are longstanding principles. And he even said, if you live according to ethical principles, you will do the right thing most of the time. And that's all we can ask of people. But there's compelling books. Read Marvin Frankel's book, Man's Search for Meaning, where about his life in a concentration camp and the kinds of decisions you had to make. But let's talk to us sitting in this room. Us sitting in this room, most of the decisions we have to make are not life and death decisions. It's more like decisions Your boss asks you to do something that's illegal. What do you do? Or you see a colleague stealing from the workplace. What do you do? Well, you have a moral obligation there, and most people blow it off. And as a result, then not only do we have the unethical conduct, but then we have your contribution to the unethical conduct, and it becomes a corrupt workplace. So what ethics does, and once you know the principles are, and one of my opening scenarios in class, you go and buy something in the store, and the store cashier has a trainee thing. He's having trouble with the cash register and gives you 20 euros too much change. You know, what do you do? Well, the first thing you should do, you say, wow, I'm presented with an ethical dilemma. This is great. I have to make a choice. But too often people just take the money and go. You say, wait a minute, what's your obligation to that person? That person might get fired. That person might get suspended. And what's your right to that 20 euros? The answer is you have no right to it. So even things that normal people do that we think are just, this is the way people act. If you act selfishly without regard for other human beings, that's always unethical conduct. So even those basic principles, you know, kids in the playground knocking each other over, right? You have an obligation as an observer to that, and too often we blow that off. So my point is, without going on, my point is most decisions are small and build up, but your intolerance for unethical conduct builds over time. It builds your confidence to act when you have to act, especially on behalf of others. This is not to say there's some, you know, global craziness going on right now that we're all aware of, people in horrible circumstances. But to act as an ethical person relies on the same principles, you know, really no matter where you are. So I don't think it's as hopeless as you present, because when I've worked with the UN, there's a lot of people who are dedicated to the mission. They want to make a difference in the world. And these are the people you want to surround yourself with. There's a lot of well-motivated people who are trying their very best to do the right thing. And those are the people that you select and you hang out with them. And there's a cascading effect.
Thank you so much,
Sure.
Jay. Any other questions? Lisbon, do we have any other questions?
No, thank you. No, thank you very much. I thank all the speakers and the very high quality of their interventions, and saying hello here from Lisbon.
Thank you, Professor Margarida. She's in Lisbon now with other colleagues and students there. If you don't mind, I just have one last provocation here, another one. We have another one. Professor Marrana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. My question is for Professor Jay Albanese. You didn't talk about high-level corruption. Let me put you an example. Why on earth should anybody get an annual bonus of dozens of millions? Why not consider this the very beginning of corruption? Because how does this happen? As far as I see it, it's not the shareholders that gives bonuses of millions, of dozens of millions to a CEO. Usually, it's not their interest. They're losing money. Usually, it's the CEO that forms a committee that decides those bonuses. These committees are formed with other CEOs. So usually in the committees, maybe there's some ministers or some bank regulators or so. We had a clear example of this with a bankruptcy in Portugal a few years ago. This level of corruption is it's very, very important because it takes billions out of the economy. And more than that, it poisons the very structure of power. Could you say something about it?
Yes, another difficult question. Yeah, the issue, I mean, from my view, high-level corruption and low-level corruption is an overrated distinction. High-level corruption generally occurs among people in positions of authority. They're elected or appointed government officials, or they're corporate officials. But most of us who are making ethical or unethical decisions are not in those positions, and we tend to call it lower level corruption. That's only because those people temporarily have those positions. No one is president for life, with a few exceptions. But my point is, if something appears wrong but isn't illegal, what happens? We had a recent president in my country, right, who appointed his daughter and son-in-law to high-level positions in government. That is considered nepotism in many, many countries and isn't allowed. And in my country, it was permitted. Arguably, that shouldn't happen. But what you need when that happens, whether it's the corporate official getting an outsized bonus, or conduct within the government that isn't technically illegal. Obviously, if it is illegal, if it's bribery or extortion or something, well, they should be prosecuted. But sometimes it's not technically illegal. They're just making a decision that reeks of self-interest. That's why you need civil society. Civil society is extremely important. Civil society are NGOs. Civil society is the media. Civil society is academia, faith-based organization. They have to scream long and hard. In your example of the corporate crime, you need shareholders to scream about that in an organized way, and shareholders to get in the newspaper, and shareholders say, this is unbelievable. This should not happen. And so many new laws and regulations that get passed oftentimes are the result of civil society showing an intolerance for the behavior. And I think, globally, there's not enough of that. Civil societies almost expects a certain level of corruption in, whether it's government agencies or whatever it might be. And to me, civil society has to be informed, aroused, aware, and insistent that we do not tolerate this kind of conduct. And hopefully you make enough, you make enough noise and things change. And there are examples of this around the world. But I am concerned at the same time, though, if you want to look at the other side, I mean, we also have a planet in which journalists are being assassinated. All right. We have a world in which some NGOs are being suppressed due to political reasons. These are like, but see that all of us who are ethically inclined, this is a reason to shout louder. And sure, you want to shout louder, what? The law has to be changed, that person has to be out, whatever the issue is. But I think there's responsibility for those outside that little conduct, accepting the multi-million-dollar bonus, which, as you say, you're correct. It's a self-enabling thing. He's being given the money by basically friends. But if it isn't in the interest of the corporation, well, the shareholder should be screaming. They should be writing editorials in the paper. They should be doing petition drives. They should be interviewing with reporters. I think increasingly, especially with the rise of authoritarian thinking in some of the corporate world as well as the government world, the civil society has to be louder and more insistent, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. I think we have someone that wants to answer our student online. Luís?
Sim. Yes.
Sorry.
No, thank you. No, thank you very much. I want to make a very quick point because the student, she didn't say the name, so I could not, unfortunately, but it was a very interesting question. And as she repeatedly spoke about the UN, I want to address it also from the police and from the UN point of view. One, in terms of the UN institutionally, clearly, the United Nations Security Council plays a key role, as well as the General Assembly, in addressing all the challenges. And it's, I would say, the institution where all speak with each other. And the dialogue, it's very, very relevant. Second, because the question entailed a certain level of radicalization. And unfortunately, in some of the missions where the United Nations Police is, the radicalization, even if we have radicalization also in countries in Europe, in America, and in the other continents, but the radicalization happens when there is also, unfortunately, the absence of alternatives. And it's even if it happens in Europe, where there are a lot of good ways and solidarity, social security, in some of these environments, it's very difficult to address. So I would say that we all have an international, individual, social responsibility in terms of security, but also in terms of humanitarian and in terms of development. So I was very happy to listen the student. One final point, bringing, and I would challenge the student to read, even if in the UN there are a lot of acronyms, but it is important then to go into detail and to see what they mean. Our Secretary General recently presented our common agenda, being one of the first message, leaving no one behind. And I believe that in her spirit, and of course, the police plays a key role in terms of preventing radicalization, not more than that, in terms of helping in the social contract in the society, and helping of course, to offer to everyone hope in terms of their future. So I wanted to address that point. Second, the last question. I will not discuss, of course, in terms of the CAOs, but I want to make a point in terms of how important it is in terms of the responsibility that political leaders, but also the civil society has in terms of an informal and formal control mechanism of the people that have responsibilities in terms of the destiny of the countries. Because that it will be very relevant in a certain way to have the societies in homeostasis. So thank you very much, and I stop here.
Thank you, Luís. Any other questions? Well, if not, I will close this panel with a little bit of delay. Thank you all for having us here, and I will invite you to come to the second part of the two-day Congress. In the afternoon, we'll have Professor Dimitar from Bulgaria, Marisa from Qatar University, Professor Subhasis from India, but it's here with us. We also will have Transparency International, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, so we have a journalist panel, moderator Marco Teixeira, and the Doutora Ana Gomes, well-known political commentator. Hope to see you in the afternoon. Thank you so much. Have a nice day. Thank you.